Hello and welcome to our third and final video when we are going to go and evaluate the simulation and the amount of movement that we are performing on that patient. To run the simulation, we only go down here and we are going to just click on play and we are going to see how teeth are moving. One important thing to check in here that not always all the people does it is to see how the movements are being performed, if sequential or simultaneously. So in this case, as you can see, we are first moving this canine and lateral, and then everything else is starting to move. So this is a sequential movement. This is going to make the case more predictable. The only thing is that it will increase the amount of aligners. We can also perform the movement simultaneously. The amount of aligners will decrease, but also does the predictability. Then we are going to go and look at the attachments. So we need to make sure that those lower attachments are not colliding with those upper teeth. Sometimes we may have trouble when we have a very deep overbite and the lingual surface of the upper incisors may collide with the attachments of the lower incisors. In those situations, we may ask for bite ramps to help us to just open more the vertical dimension and avoid that. So normally the attachments with this shape, like the ones we see in these lower premolars, and the vertical ones are going to help us for rotations and translation to mesial or distal. The ones like in this upper lateral are going to help us to make extrusion movements. Also, it will help us to get retention of the aligner and to make torque, lingual root torque or buccal root torque. So those are the functions. And in here we have this simulation of where the buttons will go in the patient. Remember that the buttons you need to actually bond it by yourself, and you also need to buy the buttons. You need to select if you want to use metal buttons or if you want to use composite buttons. And you are going to use, for example, in this case, an elastic from that upper canine to the lower first molar. It is really important to notice also if we have enough space to make the movement. Sometimes we may end up in a refinement because we didn't have enough space to make rotations or angulations or intrusion or extrusion. So we are going to run little by little this staging. As you can see in here, we generated a space and then those other teeth are going to start to move. So this is something that we need to check, that we have enough space to move those teeth around. So if we have space, we are going to have some values that are trying to help us to remain in a predictable range. So when we want to do those translation movements to mesial, distal, buccal or lingual, normally if we stick to less than 2 millimeters, everything will track really well. If we want to perform intrusion or extrusion in posterior teeth, we try to stay around 0.5 millimeters of movement or less, but with the anterior teeth, normally we can achieve 2 millimeters or even in some situations more than this. For rotation in anterior teeth, we can go up to 40 degrees and in posterior teeth up to 15 degrees. It is important that to obtain these values, also the use of attachments will be needed. So, to evaluate the amount of movement that we are doing, we can just select the grid and we can just run the staging and see the amount. Or it is easier just by selecting superimposition, so we can see the amount of movement that we are doing. It is important that in cases that we are exceeding this value, then auxiliary techniques may be needed. So for example, if we were having a big rotation, let's say in here in this lateral, we may need to create dimples with detailed pliers, or if it was a premolar, we may need to use some buttons and elastics to help to finish that rotation. Or this is something that when we have a patient with a high density bone, we may also need to add an auxiliary technique. but normally if we stay near those values, the final result will be really nice. And finally, when running the simulation, we are going to check if we have IPR. So we only need to click on IPR to evaluate the amount of IPR that is being prescribed. It is really important to make this amount of IPR or the case most probably is not going to track. So we just go and click over the number and it's going to tell me when I need to do it. So for example, in here we can see that we have IPR between teeth 26 and 27 and it is 0.4 millimeters before aligner number 7. So I always need to do that IPR before the aligner number 7, or in this case, for example, 0.2 millimeters before I give the patient the aligner number 2. So this is something else that you can also customize. You can tell the technician, please perform as a maximum 0.3 millimeters of IPR, and he will follow your instructions. So this is our last video, and I want to thank you all for joining us. And do not hesitate to contact our clinical support team for any further questions. Thanks.